scripture reading this morning comes from the second letter to Corinthians, chapter 12, and verses 9 and 10. 2 Corinthians 12, verses 9 and 10. And he said to me, "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore I will boast all the more gladly of my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may rest on me. For the sake of Christ, then, I am content with weaknesses, insults, hardships, persecutions, and calamities. For when I am weak, then I am strong." Amen. Amen.
Good morning, church. Good morning. Thank you. So I'm always really grateful and happy to come up here to talk about God's word and hopefully encourage someone. I get encouraged every time I have to study the Bible for a subject that I want to talk about. And so the last time that I was up here, I was talking about idolism. Okay, I was speaking about the dangers of idolism. I was talking about how it doesn't always appear in the typical form of worshipping God, but it's also things that we can place above God too often in our lives. And so what I wanted to talk about specifically off the back of that is temptation and sin, especially to the things that we can get so addicted to, the things that we struggle with, the things that we may try so hard not to do, the things we try so hard not to consume, the things that we may try so hard not to listen to, the things we may try hard not to eat. I know about that one. The things that we may also try hard not to watch. The thing is, what do we do with these things? How do we deal with these issues? With these things that we're so addicted to? With the things that, when the urge is so strong, you may find yourself saying to yourself, or even praying to God, "I can't stop. I can't stop." And so that's the title of what I want to talk about today. So what is this feeling? What is this temptation? Temptation is that thing that attracts or entices, it allures you, and it usually has a negative connotation when people use that word. Temptation in the context I'm talking about is the temptation to sin. When Satan, the tempter, tempts us to want or desire to do anything that goes against God, to want or to desire to do anything to give us a satisfaction disregarding our obedience to God. But when it comes to our addictions, temptation can feed on it. In fact, they feed off each other, because as we're tempted more, we give in more, and then we get more addicted, and then we get more tempted, and this loop just goes round and round. And I'm sure we've all been there before, and I'm sure some of us are there now. Now, I don't know anyone who plans to be addicted to bad things. I know people who give in to sin. I know people who who continuously give in to the same sin, but I don't know anyone who plans to be addicted to food. I don't know anyone who plans to be addicted to alcohol. I don't know anyone who plans to be addicted to drugs. I don't know anyone who plans to be addicted to pornography, or to gossip, or to anything that you may be struggling with. And yet it's so everywhere, all the time in the world. And it gets worse. And as it starts to get worse, we start to compromise. And we think, "Oh, well, I can just do this thing now, and then I can just pray about it later on." Where we end up switching off all thinking, and we start thinking, "Oh, well, I'll just deal with this addiction later on in life, and I can just carry on with what I'm doing." And that's destructive, and that's dangerous, and it takes you further and further downhill until one day you look back and you realize how far you have to climb just to get back up. Okay, so how does this work? Let's look at James chapter 1. James chapter 1, verses 14 and 15. And in James 1, 14 to 15, James is speaking, obviously, And he says, each one is tempted when he is driven away by his own desire and enticed. Okay? Then when desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin, and sin, when it's full grown, brings forth death. So first you have the desire of wanting to satisfy whatever it is that you may be feeling. Hungry, tired, lonely, angry. It starts with you being in a place of weakness, because that's where Satan likes to begin, where you are weak. When Jesus was tempted in the wilderness, Jesus was fasting, so he had a kind of human weakness at the moment. It says in Matthew chapter 4, it says, after fasting 40 days and 40 nights, he was hungry, and the tempter came and said to him, if you are the Son of God, command these stones to become loaves of bread. He comes to you when you're in a place of weakness. It could be a momentary human weakness like Jesus had in the wilderness, or it could be a sinful one like gluttony, or greediness, or jealousy, like we humans tend to fall into. Or it could be a situational weakness, like you're feeling lonely, or unloved, or unfairly treated. Satan looks for these weaknesses, and that's where it usually starts. And so when I think of people in the Bible who gave in to sin, and those who didn't, there are two people that come into mind. Two different people in different situations who handle temptation differently. We have a king of Israel, and we have the son of Israel as well. We have King Solomon, and we have Joseph. Okay? And between these two people, if I was to read you like a biography of their situation, you would think it would happen differently. On one hand, we have King Solomon, who was incredibly smart. He was smart enough to ask God for wisdom when he was offered anything. With that wisdom, he wrote the book of Proverbs, Songs of Songs, a very wise man, son of David. And then on the other hand, we have Joseph, a boy who was not as fortunate early on in life. Joseph, who was taken into slavery by his own family, had everything go wrong in his life. He could have been angry at God for being in that situation. So we have wise Solomon, and we have poor Joseph. Who would you expect to be in? So let's look at 1 Kings chapter 11. And I'll skip a couple verses to save time whilst I'm reading. But 1 Kings chapter 11, verse 1. Now King Solomon loved many foreign women. Verse 2. From the nations concerning which the Lord had said to the people of Israel, you shall not enter into marriage with them, neither shall they with you. For surely they will turn your hearts away after other gods. Solomon clung to these in love. He had 700 wives who were princesses and 300 concubines. Verse 4. For when Solomon was old, his wives turned his heart after other gods. And his heart was not wholly true to the Lord his God, as was the heart of David his father. Verse 6. So Solomon did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, and did not wholly follow the Lord as David his father had done. So Solomon married a whole heap of people that he was not supposed to marry. And he had gone on to build these high places to worship other gods at, because of what his wives had led him to. So in verse 11 it says, therefore the Lord said to Solomon, since this has been your practice, and you have not kept my covenant and my statutes that I have commanded you, I will surely tear the kingdom from you and will give it to your servant. Okay, so it's no secret that wise Solomon had a weakness. All right, his weakness was women, multiple women. It's not a unique weakness. Okay, 700 wives and 300 concubines. It was all just greediness and gluttony, so maybe you can add that to his list of weaknesses. The big problem wasn't just the way he treated marriage, and maybe clearly the way he treated women, but also the fact that he let them lead him away from God. As king over Israel, God's chosen people, he should never have let that happen, because he had a certain responsibility. King Solomon had the wisdom, but he didn't have the strength, really. And that's why whenever I pray for things, I always pray for wisdom and strength, the two things together, because they kind of go together. Because without the strength, you might have the wisdom to do something, but you might not have the strength to go through with it, like Solomon. And without the wisdom, you might have the strength to do things, but you might end up going down the wrong path if you don't have the wisdom to go along with the strength. In this case, King Solomon had wisdom, but he didn't have the strength. And so he allowed his addiction to lead him away from God, and that's just sad for him, and that's sad for Israel. And now on to Joseph. So when Joseph was young, he had been mistreated by his brothers. I'm sure most of you know the story. They plotted to kill him for being the favorite son of Jacob, Israel, and for having a couple of dreams. He'd been sold into slavery, and he ended up working for Potiphar, who was a high-ranking Egyptian. And so Potiphar had noticed that God was with Joseph, because everything that Joseph did was really successful. Like, imagine that. Potiphar's whole household was blessed just because Joseph was there. So Potiphar naturally put Joseph in charge of everything that he had. So let's go to Genesis chapter 39. Genesis 39, verses 6 to 11. Okay, and verse 6 says, "So he left all that he had in Joseph's charge. And because of him, he had no concern about anything but the food he ate. Now Joseph was handsome in form and appearance, and after a time his master's wife cast her eyes on Joseph and said, 'Lie with me.' But he refused and said to his master's wife, 'Behold, because of me, my master has no concern about anything in the house, and he has put everything that he has in my charge. He is not greater in this house than I am, nor has he kept back anything from me except you, because you are his wife. How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God?' And as she spoke to Joseph day after day, he would not listen to her, to lie beside her or to be with her. But one day, when he went into the house to do his work, and all of the men of the house were not in there, she caught him by his garment, saying, 'Lie with me.' But he left his garment in her hand, and fled and got out of the house." So here we have handsome Joseph, and he's caught the eye of his master's wife, and she wants him to lie with her. Was he tempted? Was he attracted to her? We don't know. The Bible doesn't say. But what we do know is that he flat out refuses time after time. Now, too many people in Joseph's position would have given up by this point. Too many people would have been angry at the world, angry at their situation, angry at other people, angry at God, and would have given into the temptation that was presented in front of them. But not Joseph. He remained strong against temptation, unlike King Solomon, who had everything. So now, when it comes to the things that we're addicted to, when it comes to the things that we can't stop, when it comes to temptation, there are a few things that we need to do looking at Joseph, okay? Firstly, we need to be ready, and we need to choose beforehand that we're not going to sin. And that sounds really easy, but it's not. It's difficult. But as difficult as it is, it's easier than trying to decide in the moment. Don't choose in the moment, because then what happens is that you're falling prey to your current emotions and your situation. And that's a mistake that a lot of struggling people make. You have to know that these temptations are going to come, and you have to choose beforehand and be prepared for it. Plan for it and be alert. 1 Peter chapter 5, verses 8 to 10 says, "Be self-controlled and alert. Your enemy, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion, looking for someone to devour. Resist him, standing firm in the faith, because you know that your brothers throughout the world are undergoing the same kinds of suffering." You have to change your mindset as soon as you can and plan to not give in. Okay, so I'm addicted to this thing, and when the time comes, I'm going to want to do it, but I'm not going to. I'm not going to give in. Because you have to think in your head that it's not even going to be an option. And I remember every time I read this, I remember thinking that Joseph was so stern. You can see Joseph had already made a decision that he was not going to sin beforehand. And it was locked in because he was ready and he was alert. And he wasn't relying on his current situation or his current emotion, but he was relying on his logic, and he was relying on his commitment to God. as well as his commitment to his job. And I've noticed that I do far better against temptation when I plan beforehand as opposed to relying on doing things in the moment. So be prepared and be alert. Plan beforehand and be mentally ready. Secondly, let's look at Proverbs chapter 4. Proverbs 4, verses 14 to 15. And Proverbs 4, 14 to 15 says, "Do not enter the path of the wicked, and do not walk in the way of evil. Avoid it, do not travel on it, turn away from it, and pass on." Ironically, this one was written by Solomon himself. And this is a big one. You know, as Joseph did when he was tempted by his master's wife, he ran. He didn't even entertain it. So now I remember when I was younger, I was at a youth weekend, okay, and I picked up a book, and this book was written by a youth pastor, and he was talking about all these questions that he had from the youth over the years. And one of the questions were, what can I do with my girlfriend? You know, I've just started dating someone, can we kiss? Can we do this? Can we do that? And his response was amazing. As well as telling them what they shouldn't do, what he also did was he said, this could be a good question, but depending on your intentions, it can also be a bad question. Because what some people really mean when they ask that question is, what can I get away with? You know, how far can I bend God's law until I break it? You know, I may be married, but how much can I flirt with that person at work until I have to stop? How much can I talk about someone behind their back before it's really gossiping? You know, we always do this. We always start trying to go down this path, and we think we can stop before it's too late. But have you noticed we don't do that with things that we're really trying to avoid? We don't stand at the edge of a motorway or a busy train track and think how far we can lean in until we fall in. And we don't do that because we know the consequences, we know the risks, and we're really trying to avoid that. So why do we do that with the temptation that we're trying to avoid? And it's because when we play this game of how close can I get, what we're doing is we're trying to have our cake and eat it too. Or rather, we're trying to eat our cake and not eat it at the same time. We're trying to satisfy the flesh and kind of break God's law without breaking his law. We're deliberately but not deliberately leaving the window open for these temptations to come in because we're not really ready to give them up. But we're supposed to give them up. We need to run from temptation and go the other way. It says that he, Joseph, would not listen to her to lie beside her or to be with her. I'm not even going to lie next to her because that's already too far. Bending the limits before it breaks is too far. He ran. Let me tell you something about me. Me, I love food. Anyone who knew me growing up would know that already. I can eat a lot, and mostly bad stuff. I wish I loved the good stuff, but I don't. So what I do is we don't have sweets, chocolates, cakes, all that stuff. We don't have it in the house because I know what's going to happen if it's there. And I tend to end up eating better. We tend to do better when we avoid temptation as opposed to flirting with temptation. Do not enter the path of the wicked, and do not walk in the way of evil. Avoid it, do not travel on it, turn away from it, and pass on. Okay, the third thing is to have good reasons to not fall into temptation. Joseph gave good reasons. Because of me, my master has no concern about anything in the house, and he has put everything he has in my charge. He is not greater in this house than I am, nor has he kept back anything from me except you because you are his wife. Good reasons. You know, if I cheat on my partner, it may destroy our relationship, our marriage. It may ruin the relationship between me and my children. It may ruin the growth of my children. If I give in to my anger, I may say things that I can't take back, or I may destroy things that I can't mend again. If I watch things that I shouldn't be watching, it may make the addiction get stronger, and it will affect the way that I might view women or men. It may mentally ruin future relationships or even current relationships. And it's not just the physical reasons and the consequences, but also the spiritual consequences as well. Find your spiritual reasons for not giving in, like Joseph did. Joseph said, "How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God?" So it wasn't just against Potiphar he was sinning against, but it was also against God. Can you imagine the path his life would have taken if he had given in? Would he have ended up being second to Pharaoh? Or would he have fallen out of his purpose and out of his sort of anointing, like so many kings did, like Solomon did? How would it have affected his relationship with God? And how does being controlled by addiction and sin affect your relationship with God? What does it do for your family if you're controlled by addiction, especially if you're a parent? The purpose of temptation is to pull you away from God, to keep you satisfied and content with your sin. And it's hard. It's a literal spiritual battle going on. And now Paul knows what it's like. Paul in Romans chapter 7, verse 18 to 20 says, "For I know that good itself does not dwell in me. That is in my sinful nature. For I have the desire to do what is good, but I cannot carry it out. For I do not do the good I want to do, but the evil I do not want to do, this I keep on doing. Now if I do what I do not want to do, it is no longer I who do it, but it is sin that is living in me that does it." And what does Paul say about those difficulties later on in 2 Corinthians? In 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verses 9 to 10, he says, "But he, the Lord, said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore I will boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses, so that Christ's power may rest on me. That is why for Christ's sake I delight in weaknesses, in insults, in hardships, in persecutions, in difficulties, for when I am weak, then I am strong." There are so many weaknesses that we have. And one of those are addictions, those difficulties. Too often we try to handle these areas on our own. But as well as making those changes that I pointed out, we also need to learn to rely on the strength of God. My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. So it's not just you at work, but it's the strength of God working through you when you rely on him, when you pray to him, when you remember him, when you recall the Bible in difficult times, like Jesus did when he was tempted. He said, "It is written, man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God." His hunger was his physical weakness in the moment, but his spiritual strength from God was what kept him going. Solomon was so wise, he knew what was right, but his actions, his addictions, led him out of his purpose. And the thing is, whilst you're making these changes, it will get harder before it gets easier. Satan will try harder to stop you. Temptation will be stronger. Your desires will grow for a bit until it won't. Look at James chapter 4, verse 7. He says, "Submit yourself therefore to God, resist the devil, and he will flee from you." Okay, so we need to, one, be alert and ready, prepare beforehand. I won't give in. It's not going to be an option. Two, we need to avoid temptation by going in the other direction. Don't start wandering down that path like we all like to do. We need to turn away and avoid it. Three, we need to think of all the reasons and all the costs of giving in. And not just the physical cost and reason, but also the spiritual reasons as well. And lastly, we need to fully rely on God. We all have weaknesses. You have weaknesses, I have weaknesses, but God has the strength to fully cover those weaknesses if you let him. Okay, if you invite him into your life, especially into those areas where you're struggling. Open yourself up to him when you pray, when you talk to God. He wants you to open yourself up to him, to have a proper relationship with him. So where have you been letting your guard down? What windows have you left open that you need to close? What path have you been wandering down on that you need to not be on? We need to recognize and make those changes and fully rely on God. And then by God's grace, instead of you saying, I can't stop this sin, you may find yourself one day thanking God that you were able to beat that temptation and stop that sin by God's grace. Amen.
Amen.